Hello and welcome to Builders, the podcast where we talk to the people shaping the future of technology, data, AI and business. I'm your host, Lee Haynes, and today we're diving into one of the most exciting frontiers in tech, Agentic AI and the future of developer tooling. My guest is Vilhelm von Ehrenheim, co-founder and chief AI officer at QA.tech, where he's building next-generation AI systems that rethink how we approach QA testing and software quality. Vilhelm has a rich background, from deep academic and engineering roots to leading AI initiatives in major companies like EQT. His work now sits at the intersection of autonomous agents, software development, and the future of engineering teams. Today, we'll explore Agentic AI, why so many enterprise AI initiatives stumble, and what the next wave of AI-powered developer tools means for the entire software lifecycle. So we've got lots to talk about. Vilhelm, a warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Lovely to have you with us. Let's start with your story, as we often do with our guests. How did your career path lead you into AI and eventually to founding QA.tech?
I studied engineering physics from the start, actually, and then I was more into, space and theoretical physics and stuff at the beginning. But then I kind of realized I really liked building stuff and kind of programming and things. And when you look at those kind of institutions where they do this kind of more theoretical physics research, it's mostly just kind of sitting there with a pen and paper, And I really wanted to build stuff. So then I kind of realized I wanted to change the course a little bit. So then I went more into mathematical statistics and kind of algorithm theory and stuff. And then that naturally led to machine learning, right? I was originally set on doing a PhD, but then kind of things happened and I got in contact with Klarna and they were doing all this cool stuff and wanted to build out more machine learning in their automatic decision for credit and fraud. So I joined that team, and that kind of set me on the path towards AI stuff, like already from the start. Yeah,
fantastic. And you've worked in both, high growth startups and large enterprises, right? What perspectives did those different environments give you about building AI driven products?
I mean, it's very different, of course, like working in a smaller company or a high growth company compared to larger enterprises. I think EQT is somewhat special in that regard still. But what you felt at Klarna was pretty much kind of all the way through, like you felt like anything was possible. You were kind of encouraged to experiment and kind of build things like crazy. And that was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot, and there was a lot of good engineers there that you can kind of learn from as well. And then kind of moving into EQT, I think EQT has this kind of also this kind of encouraging kind of setup where you should try, you should do your best, and you should really kind of go for it, right? They encourage you to kind of ask for forgiveness rather than kind of permission, right? Like you should just go for it. And then and I think that was really good. And then, of course, it's very different in a larger organization. But we started out building Motherbrain, as it's called, that I kind of was building this AI initiative more as a startup internally. Like we were like a small weird team sitting in a corner somewhere, and then that grew into being like more of a core kind of part of the larger organization. But from the start, it was very natural going from this high growth kind of more startup-y environment to starting to kind of build a little bit similar to a startup from scratch internally at EQT as well.
And were there any, let's say, pivotal moments or decisions that kind of, in those environments that kind of shape the way you think about AI today and how you're kind of working with it at QA.tech?
I mean, there's been so many pivotal moments in AI. I think like over the last over my entire career. I think initially I think there was a lot of distrust in AI systems and in machine learning and things in general. So I was always kind of trying to convince people like this is possible. We just need more data, more compute, all these things. Think more about the problem, structure things in a smarter way or something. And there is always this kind of, when you have hesitation from the organization and you do something kind of small and try it out, then it's very hard to get like super good performance from the start. You need to kind of show direction rather, right? So I think like understanding that was very kind of important early. So like not only just showing that it's possible with like poor performance, but you also need to show the direction. Like, if we grow the data set, then we see this trajectory. It's going to go better. We kind of need more money or more kind of things to actually kind of complete this and make it into a successful project. I think that was super important. I think that was also the case at EQT. And then I think you always get like, amazed by all the stuff that is happening and all the research so you try to follow that and kind of, I think I was very kind of skeptical to the idea of kind of larger kind of pre-trained models initially. I think that was, this is probably not going to be relevant. Like we have all this data, we already know what we want to do, right? But then that turned out to be like super powerful. And I remember these kind of pivotal moments when you kind of have this aha feeling like, oh my God, this is super powerful. This is going to be the future, and that like, you just suddenly need to change your mind completely, right? It's really cool.
Yeah. And fast forward to today, QA.tech, tell us a bit about the company. What's it doing? So
essentially what we do is we try to kind of automate testing of web products. So traditionally, what you do is when you build stuff, in order to make sure that it works, you need to kind of click through the entire application essentially, or like all the important flows at least. And that's traditionally done either by people, like clicking manually, or by trying to kind of hard code scripts. And those hard-coded scripts are very kind of not smart. They're kind of, just click this specific position, wait 300 milliseconds, fill in this field. And then if something changes, they just break. So they don't really test like the application's kind of functionality per se, but rather like testing that it's possible to click in a certain pattern, right?
Right.
And the problem with that is that as you're building out your product, you probably change a lot of stuff. That's kind of what you want to do as an engineering organization. So then you need to spend a lot of engineering time maintaining and kind of building out these scripts instead, which has been kind of the aim for a lot of companies for quite some time. But then also more and more companies are realizing that this is not scalable. We need to go back to kind of manual or like do something different, right? Yeah. And that's kind of the point, the pain point that we came out of as well. Like this should be doable with like smarter systems. It's just very complicated input spaces when you think about it. It's like a lot of different things that can happen. So there needs to be a lot of smartness in the AI systems in order to be able to handle them. Yeah. And that's where agents are coming in. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, exactly. And to talk a bit about kind of agentic AI and kind of how agents learn and kind of how they act, how they improve. I think agentic AI is a term we're hearing a lot now, right? But often I think, sometimes with different meanings, right? So for listeners, I'm kind of framing it as like an agent. It doesn't just answer a prompt. Let's say it kind of plans, it takes actions, checks results, it tries again until it reaches a goal. Essentially, how do you define agentic systems in practice, and what makes an agent truly agentic rather than just like a fancy chatbot, for example?
Yeah, I think when you think about it, agents is not like a new term per se. It's been around for a long time. And if you think about it more from the kind of classical, either from robotics or cognitive science, then it's much more about like having a perception of the world. So you can't know the entire world, right? Like which like normal agents like you and me cannot do, but we can kind of perceive it. And then we can take actions that affects the kind of surrounding environment, right? Yeah. And there is this kind of loop of action and perception that you can do continuously, and you do that to kind of reach your goals in different ways. It could be to reduce uncertainty, or to kind of, get food for your family or whatever, right? And then and the same kind of comes with AI agents, right? Like if you just kind of have something that kind of answers a prompt, there's not really much perception or action going about. It's just kind of input output. It's more like a straight like function call, right? Yeah. So I think what needs to be there in order for it to be an agentic system is this kind of possibility to perceive and kind of understand things, dig out more context or whatever, and then take actions to actually do something. And that's essentially like a decision, right? The action could be kind of oh, I don't have enough data, so I need to start crawling or kind of fetching more data from this thing. Or it could be like send an email to this person when I'm done and kind of have this thing or whatever.
Yeah. And the key here is that it's done without the need for them to be prompted to do so, right? It's kind of they're doing these multiple steps autonomously. So when you're designing agents, how do you ensure they kind of perform specific desired tasks reliably and safely, especially when they're taking these kind of autonomously?
Yeah. I think this has been around in like reinforcement learning for quite some time. It is hard when you have like deferred reward, right? Like if you have very long kind of chains of actions, it becomes more and more complicated to see that kind of reward trickle all the way back to the original kind of decisions. The way I think about it is to be a little bit more kind of just pragmatic, try to kind of break up the chains as much as possible, have the different kinds of states where you have like all the stuff that has happened up to a certain point, whether it's kind of correct or not. And then you kind of have the possibility to take a decision, or the agent has then. You store that data, like everything that goes into that, and then you kind of tell it or kind of store what you think is the best action. And then you can kind of run the agent in a similar kind of setup again, and then you can kind of compare, like, given all of this input data, what would it have done? And then you have that for all the different kinds of small parts in the decision chain. Then it's easier to kind of reason about the decision kind of performance of the agents per se. And then you can kind of also have validation sets for the larger kind of more longer running kind of goal or reward or whatever as well. So you could say, out of if we run, in our case, like we're running like tests on web pages, maybe I have kind of a page where I know where there are some errors, right? Like, and I have, or of course we have those, and then you can kind of run all the agency through again, and then you can see, did they find the same things? Where did it stumble? Like, this agent got lost somewhere. Okay, So you have like both these kind of isolated evaluations, and then you kind of have the kind of more kind of global ones as well. I think that's a good kind of combination too.
And I think the kind of big shift is also now kind of moving towards this kind of multi-step agent loops, right? Where you've got the planning, the acting, the observing, and like, the refining and iterating, right? Which is really, really powerful, but it also kind of increases the potential or the surface area for errors, right? Or kind of unexpected behavior. Where have you seen agents add real value already? And where do you think they're still too fragile?
I mean, I think it is very important to have a pretty clear goal about what you want them to achieve. For example, I heard this talk from Zapier recently, where they kind of had all of these old integrations that they have a hard time kind of maintaining, and then they get like customer support requests from that. Then they have an agent kind of actually analyzing that, going out, fetching all the documentation for that specific integration, and then kind of applying and trying to make a fix, and then kind of you get that as a PR, as a customer service. I think that's a super cool use case. It's also very focused. Like, it is a specific kind of problem about old integrations, like and I know that kind of there are a lot of those kind of use cases where I think it makes a lot of sense. Maybe you have some kind of internal like security documentation, for example, and then you want to have a bot that is easily kind of that you can use to answer kind of security questions, maybe about your company, something that we build out. That's kind of also an easy kind of important use case that makes my kind of work as security responsible kind of less demanding, right? I can kind of offload a little bit. I can kind of review and work with the team still to kind of make sure that it makes sense. But there are a lot of these kind of, but I think you need to be very focused and specific about what you want to achieve. In the case of testing, I think that's very, very, very clear. Like we kind of both have agents to scan and kind of collect information about the application that we're about to test. We build out a knowledge graph about this, and then we have agents that just should be able to perform tasks, right? It's also very specific. Like, it should be able to log in. It should be able to check out with these pair of socks. It should be possible to send an invoice, right, or whatever.
Exactly.
And then you can kind of validate and isolate that specific task. And then when it comes to kind of building the knowledge and understanding which things are interesting to test in an application that's also very specific, and then we can isolate the agents on those specific tasks and kind of validate that they know what they're doing.
Yeah. No, it's a very, very good point, and I think it's the same with manual testing as well, right? It's kind of a clear objective. You have a clear expectation. Does it work or not, essentially? But in the agent world, and kind of talking a bit about evaluation there, like the tests and the benchmarks that we use to kind of check whether an agent, actually completes real tasks reliably, right? It's kind of moves from, did it answer well to like, did it reliably complete a task kind of end to end under, realistic constraints, essentially?
I mean, when you typically kind of evaluate the chatbots, it's actually a little bit more wonky because you have a lot of different ways to phrase things, and you need to kind of use LLMs to kind of. But some of these agentic tasks are pretty verifiable, right? Like it's kind of. It's the same like when you produce like a answer to a math thing, or if it's kind of a programmatic task, then you can try to run that and see if it actually works. And the same goes for a lot of these kind of agentic workloads. Maybe you have like an agent that should analyze something, call an API, fetch some information, and make sure that you kind of solves a task. And if that task is solved or not, like that, maybe that's verifiable, right? So
yeah. And what do you, with all this in mind, what do you think most teams or a lot of companies get wrong when they try to evaluate agents? Or are there any frameworks or methods that you use to kind of measure specifically whether an agent's actually improving or doing what it's expected to do?
I think most companies do, or at least in my experience, this has been the same for a long time in ML in general. Like, I think the first thing you need to think about is what the problem you're actually trying to solve, right? Like, and how do you measure whether or not that is a good kind of solution? Because that is super crucial. Then, in order to be able to evaluate whether or not the agent is doing a good job, you need to know what the job is, like, and how to measure that. Like, and I think the hype has kind of made a lot of companies pretty stressed about it as well. So then you kind of start doing like, we need to do something with AI, which is not necessarily kind of problem oriented. Like, rather than doing it the other way around, you're like, I have this problem, how should I solve this? This is really hard. Okay, we can use AI for this, right? And then you come more naturally out of like, oh, we need to solve this problem. Then we know about the problem itself and how to measure it, like from the start, rather than it's being the other way around. I think when you just kind of deploy like a new chatbot across an organization and you see a little bit more usage or less usage, like, is it good? I don't know. Like, it's the same. I think you see the same with AI-enabled kind of development at the moment. Like, the data is clear. Like, you have data from, there is a new report from Stanford, for example. McKinsey also did like a huge kind of research on this as well. Like, how does it actually affect the developers? And the data is clear. It does like make us more efficient, but the variability is massive. Like, some companies actually lose performance, like, and some gain a lot of performance, and it's very much depending on like how you structure the processes and the work and the context and your projects and like everything. You need to be very mindful about like both what is it that you're measuring and what are you kind of trying to achieve, and also be kind of very clear about what context and how you kind of work with these systems in order for them to actually do a good job, because they're not just going to make everything magically better if you sprinkle it on top, right?
No, exactly. It's not just this magic wand, right?
No.
And we'll talk much more about kind of AI enablement in software development as well, very, very shortly. But before moving on to that, one of the big promises of this kind of AI, agentic AI is, that systems learn over time, right? It's kind of reinforcement. But what does that look like in reality? What are the hardest parts to get that right?
Well, first of all, I think this is actually what we're like missing to reach like more kind of real AGI. Like, we're talking about like what people think about AGI is also very anthropomorphized. Like, you think more like it should be something like a human intelligence. When you think about a human intelligence, it is much more kind of dynamic in this regard. Like, what we have in our kind of perception action loop is also like a simulation of self. So like I can kind of know that if I don't do this, then I will be late, and that will infect like how I kind of can go through my day or whatever, right? Which is not really kind of what an AI model has at all. Like the only way to do that and to build that out today is to work with the context. And the context is like, it's more like, they're like the person in the film Memento, right? Like they don't have any memory apart from what they have written down and kind of what you give them, right? Like this and you need to constantly kind of just look at your notes, read through all the stuff, and like, whoa, what was I doing? Okay, then I produce an answer, and then it's like the next time around, like hopefully I wrote that answer down, right? Of course, it's still very powerful. You can come up with a lot of kind of ways to kind of work with this context in smart ways, like structure memory, like knowledge graphs, fetching kind of similar information that's relevant, that has happened before, or like whatever, and in that way kind of build up this kind of feeling of memory. But it's not really the same kind of memory and kind of action loop that we have as humans, right? Like, so it is very different still. But you can mimic it. So what we do is essentially like in regards to testing, we kind of store information about like what the agent sees, and what happens when it's testing, and also when we're kind of doing this agentic crawling stuff into a knowledge graph. And then it can kind of use that and kind of update that as it kind of works through the application. And then that makes it more like this kind of learning loop, even though it's not actually learning happening, right? It's more like this building out the data.
Yeah. Building out the memory kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
To talk a bit about AI enablement in software development then in QA.tech and its role here. You're kind of working at this, it's a really fascinating intersection, right? AI and developer tooling, QA automation. Loads and loads happening, but I'm just interested to hear kind of what opportunities you see right now in bringing and deploying AI in software development. This is nothing new, of course.
The first and foremost one is definitely coding, like in general. Like today you can be so much more efficient, and it's also easier to kind of to do more and kind of widen your T shape, right? Like it is possible to, even as a backend engineer, deliver like a feature all the way into the front end kind of customer facing parts, and then maybe have like a colleague there that can kind of help you build it out even more. But you can kind of merge the teams. Everything gets a little bit more smudged, and I think it kind of naturally leads us towards a slightly different configuration. That is definitely the case. I think also it's much easier to prototype stuff. So like from a product perspective, kind of getting feedback from users much earlier. Like you can build like a lovable kind of app of your idea pretty quickly, and then kind of get some feedback and try to click around and see how it feels. You could do that before with designers and Figma, and kind of it took a lot longer. And that's still valuable. Maybe it's definitely still valuable in a lot of different cases. But you can shortcut some of these things where it's not like super important exactly how to do it, and also to get like user feedback earlier. On the kind of review side, there's more and more tools coming as well that can kind of help you build have a better kind of source map and understanding of your code base and kind of structure, and what is important when it comes to code quality, and what rules have you as a development team, and kind of help the agents kind of figure out whether or not that's kind of true. And then of course on the testing side, I think that's where we kind of try to look at it from the outside instead. Like when you're in the code base, it's the same as a developer, right? Like when you're in the code base, it's very hard to kind of really see the end product. Like even if you spin it up locally, it's not necessarily the same as it's going to be when it's deployed in a staging environment or in production, right? You have a lot of different systems and configurations and kind of databases and A/B testing and kind of campaigns or whatever like that happens differently when you deploy it. So so kind of taking this outside in perspective, kind of actually looking at it from a user's kind of perspective, clicking around, trying to look at the product. That part also needs to move faster, right? Like if we continue to do it like manually, it's just going to be a growing kind of bottleneck. And then depending on what we do, like with all the other parts of the SDLC, it doesn't matter how fast we're at coding if we need to kind of wait 2 weeks for a release, like because QA need to kind of click through everything.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's the interesting thing, because a lot, when it comes to testing, the large majority of organizations are now experimenting with this kind of AI-assisted testing, defect detection, and lots more. So the direction of travel here is very, very clear, right? Where testing is moving from a late stage kind of gate to something continuous and importantly in this context, AI augmented, right? But what does kind of AI augmented QA look like when it's working well in practice for you?
So first of all, like you need to, there's been this kind of concept of shift left for a long time within testing. Like you want to move closer to the developer. So like, and already maybe from the kind of idea stages where you think about like how to build something, how should we think about quality here? I think it is similar a little bit to what we talked about before with this. You need to know what to measure and how to kind of think about quality as well, right? Like, so what is the goal? What are we trying to achieve with this feature? And what is kind of nice and what is not nice? And then, but in order to do that, like, so how we are solving it is essentially to kind of, we take this knowledge and this kind of understanding of the application that we built out. We look at a PR when it's submitted, when the developer submits a PR, we kind of analyze that PR, kind of tie it to the knowledge, what is actually affected in the product, kind of depending on this change. And then we kind of go into the preview deployment and click through like that specific change and those features that could potentially be affected and write the report. And then you get like a full report with screen recordings and things that you can see whether or not it's kind of functioning nicely. And then you can do that like already before merging into a staging environment. And then when you kind of move that into a staging, then you can kind of promote these tests to your regression suite and have like smoke tests and regressions kind of running automatically in staging before actually kind of releasing this change to production. And then you have had tests being kind of part of the entire chain, right? Like it's kind of moving along with you through the different stages. So you should be able to kind of catch bugs earlier in the process and then kind of feed that back into either the developer or the coding agent or the kind of or the developer together with Cursor maybe, like and help them fix it quicker.
And how do you see AI kind of changing the role of QA engineers in the kind of broader, software quality life cycle here? Do you expect QA roles to become more technical in terms of like owning agent workflows, evaluations, test data, or more kind of product oriented in kind of defining the quality outcomes or the risk?
I think it will be more smudged, similar to how we see with developer and kind of product roles in general. Like people do more across the stack a little bit. But I think there is definitely this kind of position of kind of having more of a strategic thinking. I think it is nice to have somebody kind of owning this hat a little bit. You usually have that as like a tech leads or security leads in teams as well. Like there is definitely kind of still a place for having somebody thinking about the quality. How should we think about this? What's the strategy around like testing these things? And then of course using leveraging AI to kind of help you with these things instead of being like, too overwhelmed by kind of so many changes and trying to click through the same things over and over again. Like, that doesn't feel like productive work. Like zooming out a bit, letting the agents do the clicking, kind of being more kind of understanding, but I know because my intuition, like because I worked with this project for a long time, that if we change this part, this thing over here will also be affected. Maybe the agents are not smart enough to figure that out, but you have the kind of context and the knowledge. And
that's a really interesting point, right? It's like how smart will the agents get so that they are kind of omniscient. They know everything about it. They know that if you change here, it's going to affect over there. So I mean, do you eventually see this kind of end-to-end truly autonomous kind of QA? And if so, what do you think really needs to be solved first? Is it just better agents or evaluations, or is it kind of better test environments, or is it on the human or process side? What do you think really needs solving first?
I think a bit of everything, to be honest. The agents are becoming increasingly capable. I think I'm very kind of amazed with how good they are, and like even when they're lacking test data, we've had cases where, for example, an agent was tasked with like removing a warehouse in this kind of complicated system where you had different warehouses with a lot of configurations and things, and that there was no warehouses there in the because there was no kind of test data loaded properly. And the agent then, instead of giving up, he was like, oh, I need to kind of configure a warehouse so I can delete it. And then he kind of goes through this super long, complicated thing of defining a warehouse. And then kind of once it's done, like, okay, I delete it, and then kind of done.
Yeah,
it works. Yeah. So there, I think it can kind of augment some of that stuff. And they're also really good at coming up with test data. So kind of, if you have like a CRM system, but you don't have any customers, you could easily add like quite a few customers coming up with different names and things, and that's like relevant, right? So it's much easier to generate data as well. So I think we'll, but at the same time, for it to be like as valuable as possible, you need to have like more of a strategy around like how you're kind of seeding your environments with data that is relevant to test, how you're resetting those things. How you work with different kind of preview deployments. If you just have like one staging environment, then you can't, of course, do it like preview testing. It doesn't really make sense. And then, so you still need to have like all of these good engineering practices to move fast, right?
Yeah.
And the same goes with modularization in your kind of repos and your services. Like the more you can kind of compartmentalize together the change, the easier it is to actually kind of reason about it. And the same goes for the agents, right? Then when it comes to kind of browser automation, agents are becoming increasingly powerful, and they can do a lot of things now. Like there's very few things that they get confused of. I think the two things that they are kind of struggling with a little bit today is like super complicated flows when you need to scroll a lot. Like, so you scroll like all the way to the bottom of the page, you change something there, you scroll all the way up back to the top, and then you do something and you go to another page and scroll down. And it's very confusing for a human as well. When you think about it from a user's perspective, like that's not a like nice UX for a person, right? Like,
right.
So I think we're merging that a little bit as well. Like maybe we should simplify some of these user journeys to make the agents understand it. But at the same time, they are becoming more and more advanced and smarter. So,
And let's talk a bit about enterprise AI adoption and why so many projects fail, right? Because you've no doubt seen firsthand how large companies approach AI adoption, right? Especially from your time at EQT. And multiple kind of studies show this like a consistent pattern, like where most companies can pilot AI, but far fewer can kind of scale it, right? So it's like, are these AI initiatives kind of stalled before production, usually due to kind of unclear ownership or weak data foundations or whatever it might be? And we speak about this quite a lot on the podcast. Why do you think so many enterprise AI projects struggle or kind of fail outright?
I think there are several key factors here. Like the first one is a little bit what we talked about before in classic ML, right? Like you need to know what you want to solve and how to measure that. Like so preferably it shouldn't just be like some weird esoteric side project that doesn't really affect the core business, right? Like if it is, then there is not really any risk in trying it out. But of course, there's not really much success or worth kind of putting any money in it, like to actually succeed either. So I think a lot of the cases that I've seen tend to be a little bit too much like that. Like it's kind of, it would be nice if we do AI stuff, but we don't really want to kind of do something that actually affects the core business. So we just try something in a department somewhere that and I think that is a recipe for failure in general when it comes to projects. Like if you just kind of kick off something that is not necessarily affecting what's important to you, then you're not really going to care about it, and it's not going to get enough resources and so forth. So I think that's super important. And then the same goes with kind of ownership and things, right? Like if it is a very kind of important initiative, and you know what the problem is and you know how you can solve it, then you also need to have the patience and the kind of ownership to actually drive it through. It is super easy to do like a quick POC today. Like before you needed to put a lot of effort in to actually kind of build some of these stuff, and then were a bit more pod committed in the first place. But now it's so easy to kind of get the POC up. You can kind of vibe an UI. You can kind of ask an LLM to do something. But that's just like the first 10% or whatever of a project, if even that, right? And kind of actually driving it to completion where you have like a core kind of use case that actually drives ROI, and you and it affects your actual business outcome. That's so much further down the line, and you need to put a lot of effort and thinking into how to improve, how to kind of measure, how to work with this, and also kind of how to communicate this in the business so that everybody is kind of aligned on how to use it, how to work with it, and kind of how to actually kind of get value from it.
Exactly. Is there any, like, in your experience, you mentioned that kind of going back to the problem, like what problem is it that you're solving? But in your experience, like is there any other kind of early smell, let's say, that a pilot won't become durable, it won't get off the ground?
I think not knowing how to evaluate it. Like, I think you should always start with the evaluation and think about like, and even if you don't, it's okay to change that in the course of time. Like, it doesn't have to be kind of, don't have to have everything figured out from the start.
No.
But you have to have the mindset of doing that. Like, so if you just build something out and you can't really say whether or not the answers are good or like the outcomes or whatever the agent is doing, then how should you improve that and iterate on it? It's like, it's very hard. Like, you can't really do that, right? Like, you could just kind of, you try it and then it gets to be very kind of biased towards it's the same as when you're kind of trying to test your own kind of stuff that you've built. You think about it from your only little kind of slim viewport. And then when the user comes in and tries it, they're definitely going to try it in the wrong way. Like, they never think the same way that you do. Like,
exactly.
you're like looking at it, you're like, what are you doing that? You're not supposed to ask that question, you know?
Exactly.
Whatever.
Yeah. Why don't you think like I do?
Yeah, exactly.
But I mean, go on. Sorry.
No, then I think having this eval kind of mindset from the start, then seeing those things, you would add it to your eval, you would improve, and then you can also kind of update your AI models to kind of improve to actually handle those cases. And if you have like a base of evals, then you can also know that that's not going to break the other stuff that we did before. Otherwise, it easily becomes more of this kind of whack-a-mole thing. Like, I solved this for this specific customer, then I break it for another customer, and I solve that one, and then I break it for the third one, and you kind of go around whacking them all.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's, I was saying about kind of, so many AI projects fail, yada, yada, yada. It's also worth saying that it's fine. Like, from my position, I think it's fine that not every pilot becomes durable, right? Or gets off the ground, because like in fast moving AI, you should expect a chunk of experiments to die early, right? The goal is to rather like learn quickly and cheaply, right?
If you don't fail, then you're probably not trying enough, right? You should just do
exactly.
more.
You're not doing enough. Like, the real problem isn't killing pilots. It's like running pilots that teach you nothing, or keeping them alive out of like, hype or sunk cost, right? I think that's a real problem.
Yeah. The sunk cost you need to just accept. I think
exactly.
Like,
kill your darlings.
It is the same regardless of what kind of state of the art field you're trying to that moves fast. Like, you try to build towards something, you try to get better performance, and then like a new thing comes out. I mean, imagine the sunk cost, like having trained a machine learning model for like 2-3 years, and you kind of really put a lot of effort into it just to kind of understand some specific intricacies in text, and then like GPT 3.5 came out and just kind of wiped that thing out of the box. Like, you don't need it at all anymore. And there will always be these things, but then at least you kind of have built out your understanding of the problem. Your eval sets are there. It's much easier to just kind of switch to the new thing and try to understand, like, how can we squeeze even more performance or kind of solve new areas of the problem that we couldn't solve before now with this new tooling, right? If you're already in that kind of space, then you're better set up for the next iteration. And of course, there is a sunk cost to having built all of that stuff in the first place. And when you kind of, you have killing your darlings there, you need to take with you that that positions you better for the next iteration. That's why you can kind of build faster the next iteration, and why you kind of have a good ground to stand on.
If you like had to give a kind of simple checklist for like AI readiness in these bigger kind of enterprise companies, what would you say are the kind of 2 to 3 non-negotiables for you, or like that leaders inside these companies should be looking at first?
I think it's very interesting. I saw some data from, sorry, I'm kind of sidetracking a bit, but I saw some data that you do have like, on the AI adoption curve, there's like smaller companies that are kind of very, very nimble. They have high adoption. And then like you go down in adoption and up like in the SMB kind of spaces, and then you actually go up again in the very large enterprises. Yeah. So like you have the highest adoption in the kind of in the extremes. And I think that is, I mean, it's a little bit kind of, hypothetical, I guess, in a way, but I think that is because it's much easier to kind of steer this in a small organization. Everybody's so much more aligned. It's like, also maybe you don't have as much kind of legacy and the important things that you need to do. You can just kind of switch and do something new. But the large ones, they have much more budget and kind of foresight in how important this change is. So I think they can set off like first, and also it's clear that senior management and senior leadership is kind of actually believing more in AI than kind of middle management or kind of individual contributors. So I think that is also kind of visible then, because then you have the possibility to actually set aside the budget and kind of dedicate specific teams to kind of drive this and work much more with like how we could potentially kind of create a new product as well, like within our organization, right? Compared to what maybe that's harder to do for an SMB. I think the checklist would be like, because that alludes to kind of some of these things, right? I think you need to have somebody responsible for what you're doing. You need to have clear buy-in and an understanding of how it actually ties to your business, like how you're going to measure ROI on this. What is actually important? Like if we say that, okay, I need $2 million to kind of make this like super good. Okay, how does that actually affect the business? Is it worth it? Like, well, if it just shifts it with like a few new 100 users, probably not, right?
Exactly.
Like, so I think that is super important, and it's also very important because that sets it up for success or failure. Like, but then you know that earlier, like, and you can kind of understand the costs and the kind of trade-offs. And then thinking about like how, like we said over and over, like how to measure this, right? Like and start building out your data sets. The more kind of structure and thinking you can build into this part, then the better, I would say, because then you kind of actually understand whether or not you're successful. And that should of course tie into the actual problem that you're trying to solve, right? And then I think it's just kind of having the enough resources to kind of have a team and enough time for them to actually spend on this. So if you just ask them to do that aside of their kind of already full schedule, then it's probably not gonna either they're gonna stop doing what they're supposed to do on the other projects, or they're gonna not spend time on this. Most probably the latter, because they're usually already kind of incentivized to do their original tasks, right? So I think all of these things, I kind of forgot what I said already, but ownership, responsibility, to kind of measure ROI, so you can kind of stand against costs, like having a team and kind of make sure that they actually have the time to work on the problem. I think these will set you up somewhat good for success.
It's really well put. But to talk briefly about hiring, in the era of AI, it looks very, very different now. What challenges or kind of bottlenecks do you face yourself at QA.tech, or do you see companies facing as they try to build these kind of AI-capable teams?
First of all, I think the processes in hiring are kind of being flipped upside down a bit. I think a lot of this old school kind of CV screening and all of these things are kind of, it's so easy to just generate more stuff than personal letters, and you have a lot of fake applications, and it's all over the place. So I think that definitely changes things. I think it depends if you have the employer or the kind of employees kind of perspective here. But I think as an employee, I think you need to show yourself in new ways. You can't just kind of have a nice CV and submit it and hope that somebody will kind of accept you. It's going to be more of a lottery these days. I think you need to show yourself, like, depending on what your role is, like on social media, building things, like use your network kind of and go to events, all of these things to kind of actually be more present. And then from the employer side, like, look for those signs, right? Like, if you see somebody that's super kind of engaged in your specific area of problem that you want to solve, like, we were looking for this person that like really understands browser performance, then going to like an event about browser performance and seeing who's there and who cares about this problem and what they have built before and what they post on LinkedIn or whatever. That's a kind of a really good sign. And then I think more and more companies are shifting more towards like having. Before we used a lot of these kind of tests, right? Like, code on a blackboard in a kind of short period of time, or you have like a home assignment. Those are kind of also changing a little bit. I think more and more companies are kind of looking to get like a sample. So like, come and work with us for a day or something like that. Like,
exactly.
And we feel a little bit like how the dynamic works, how kind of forward deployed you are in kind of wanting to build things and how you have crazy ideas and want to understand the customers. And, so I think those, all of those parts are kind of changing a lot of how it used to be.
And in terms of kind of, software development and roles here, like there are debates obviously about the future of junior developers in the age of AI, for example. Like where do you stand on this debate? In your view, what role will junior engineers play? What skills might they focus on as AI maybe takes more of the, the routine work, to put it that way?
I think it is super interesting. To be honest, I've been kind of, changing my mind a little bit like over time here. And I think originally when you think about it, like it is better to have more senior engineers that understand system complexity and then they can leverage these AI tools and it's kind of, blah, 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 blah. But that's also partly because we're kind of stuck in the old ways of doing things. I think like, when you think about your specific system and you don't necessarily have like super kind of AI native kind of people on your team, but maybe some are not even using AI at all, and then like you need to still work in old kind of processes around like maybe you are using Scrum still or something like that, right? I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just saying like that's the old way, and I think the seniority there kind of plays a role because you understand the processes, you understand how things are normally kind of architected and things.
Right.
But you have these new companies, like there are, for example, a company called Every that I saw on this conference like last week. That's just kind of, they build different kinds of apps, and they just have one developer per app, and they kind of force it to be like a kind of compounding effect when they build things. So they build out the context for the agents at the same time as they build the application, which makes it much easier to kind of hand it off between teams or like persons then. And then, and there is like different ways of thinking about it and how you kind of structure your project so that maybe AI can play a more central role. And some of these kind of old experiences are not maybe as important anymore. And then that kind of leads to, I mean, we will, of course, always have like complicated transaction systems and blah, blah, blah that we need to kind of think about from a lot of these kind of more reliability perspectives and things. But I think it's still interesting to see that shift, right? There's kind of, there is something there. And it's the same when I see my daughter kind of on the phone. She loves using these kind of voice modes. Like I'm really awkward with it. I'm like, hey, can you... I can't sit on the bus talk, like that's really weird, but she just does it like it's not normal. And there is always this kind of mind shift in the younger generations, and I think we see that a lot in Stockholm now at the moment, where like we have a lot of young people coming out of uni. They don't want to go and build like necessarily at a large organization that is already successful. They want to build their own companies, and they want to kind of or if they're not building their own company, at least they want to work at somebody else's new company that is kind of and learn from that, and then eventually build their own company, right? So it's kind of there is this shift, I think, and you will always have this kind of younger generation challenging how we do things. Or maybe you don't need to think that way. Like maybe you can kind of sidestep this and do it differently with AI, or build your company in a different way. So I think there was always be a room for them, and I think. As a senior, you can't just sit in the boat. You need to be on your toes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really well put. Again, I think, like, in your experience as well, when you've been hiring, like more broadly now, do you see much less focus on kind of raw syntax fluency and much more focus on hiring for, problem decomposition or kind of judgment, business understanding and alignment, these kind of areas?
Yes, much more. And I think traditionally, like people were also more kind of isolated in their specific task. You were like an expert in the backend system or like data processing, and then you kind of knew pretty much only that. But now I think, at least, especially, I mean, maybe it's different in different sizes of organization, but as I see it now, it's like it's also very important to kind of have a broader kind of view of the entire kind of goal of things, to kind of reduce other process things if we just kind of use AI to kind of be faster at coding, there's still a lot of other stuff that takes up time. Like Absolutely. I think the main kind of productivity kind of sinks are still like too many meetings, too many context switching things, and so there are still things in the processes that I think we can do differently, and therefore like having people that can kind of do more and kind of think more about like how should we actually build this specific feature, instead of getting like a spec, like do this. You kind of think about it like from a little bit of a product perspective, and that also leads to kind of what is the actual impact on the business. So you need to have a little bit of business kind of eagerness and interest, and then you can take better decisions on the product side, and then you can build more stuff all the way from the back end to front end, right? And if we have more people like this that can kind of work a little bit more in isolation, similar to this kind of one developer per thing, then you can do so much more and faster without having all of these stupid meetings where we just kind of drive consensus, and it's kind of
absolutely. But as we start to wrap up here, Vilhelm, I'm interested to hear what you're excited about, or most excited about in the kind of agentic AI field, and also where you're still very cautious. Tell us a little bit about this.
I'm super bullish on agents. I think we're just sniffing the surface. Also, the capabilities have been growing kind of super rapidly. We've been doing it for 2.5 years, and to be honest, it was not possible when we started. It was way too early. Like we have struggled so much sunk cost in that kind of process, but at the same time, we've learned so much, right? And I think we see a tremendous improvement in the capabilities of the models, of the tooling around, and and how you can kind of work with agentic systems. And I think that will continue to grow, definitely. There is so much potential for organizations to automate things and automate it in a smart way, not just kind of, if this, then that way. So I think we will see much more on that, and I'm super curious about what this will lead us and what this will mean for companies, how they will kind of use this power. Like if we can do more with less now, or like will we be interested in doing more? Like, or will we be interested in margins and kind of shifting the organizations? And I'm hopeful that it will be the first, but then it's more of a product problem as well. Like we need to be very sure that we actually kind of build towards something that is valuable for the business, and not just build more crap that nobody cares about. So it's going to be super interesting, I think. What I'm more kind of hesitant about is I think the AGI hype is a little bit too hyped. I think we're kind of, I think it's easy to think about AI in the wrong way. Like we don't necessarily need AIs that functions like humans. We already have like incredibly intelligent systems, way more intelligent than people in many ways, but less so in other ways, right? It's more of a strange intelligence than it is like the same kind of intelligence as we are. And then we should learn how to use that, and there will be a lot of involvement in this as well in the new areas. And I think, of course, there's kind of challenges to the transformer architecture and whether or not this is the best ever. I think we're lacking so much in kind of actually making them more into agentic systems that like more like biological beings function. We are functioning in very different ways. So I think, I think the hype there is like wrong, right? There's something kind of that will take a much longer time than we think when it comes to these building systems like that.
Yeah. And finally, last one from me. If you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about how companies are kind of building AI products right now, what would it be? Anything you can think of?
Kind of, I think I'm a little bit tired of the just kind of simple chatbots. And I think many are. I think this is not necessarily the best interface always. I think it is super powerful. It should probably be there, but but think bigger, make them do more. Kind of, challenge your users a little bit and kind of see if you can actually solve things more end to end and not just like answer one question here and there or whatever.
Yep.
I think that was a good.
No, but they've been like last 2 years they're just popping up there. They're everywhere, right? So it's like you say, companies. It's not to say companies shouldn't have them, but
that's not the only thing you can do with AI. That's
exactly. Exactly. Fantastic. Anything you want to add before I wrap up here?
I think this has been a super fun conversation. I think I would like to encourage people to try out QA.tech. So just go into QA.tech and try it out. It's really cool.
Indeed. Well, Vilhelm, thank you so much for a really deep, energizing conversation. Really, really nice to hear your insights into Agentic AI, enterprise adoption, future of developer tooling, and lots more. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
And to everyone listening, thanks for tuning in to Builders. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss upcoming conversations with the people pushing technology forward. Until next time, keep building, and we'll see you soon.